Well, hello and welcome to Channel Africa Conversations. My name is Tsepiso Makwetla. Peter Ndoro is away today. But today's episode, we explore how Africa can move beyond the ritual of elections towards a more substantive democracy, one that is rooted in accountability, social justice, and indigenous governance traditions. So through dialogue with both Professor Siseko Kumalo, Associate Professor at the Ali Mazrui Centre for Higher Education Studies at the University of Johannesburg, and Dr. Mmabatho Mongae, Government Insights and Analytics Head of Department at Good Governance Africa, the segment will examine quite a few things. So the crisis of legitimacy in Africa's liberal democratic model, the geopolitical contest between Western and non-Western governance ideals, and of course the need to decolonize political thought and draw from African philosophies like Ubuntu. So we'll also take a look at how economic dependence, digital manipulation, and gender inequality also undermines democracy. And the episode will further argue that democracy must be really reimagined as an African living philosophy, one that delivers dignity, inclusion, and self-determination. So let me welcome both my guests, Professor Kumalo and Dr. Mongae. Very good afternoon to you both, and I really do appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Dr. Kumalo, Professor Kumalo, let me start with you. As I said, we're looking at a philosophy that is deeply rooted in African identity. So if the Afrobarometer rather says, it seems like as a concept that elections are working, people are yearning for that. But is it a crisis of delivery or is it a crisis of concept, what we're seeing now, according to the Afrobarometer study?
Thanks for having us, Tsepiso. To answer the question, I want to go back to your introductory remarks, which sort of frames the problem as a problem of liberal democracy. So if we think about how democracy has played itself out on the continent, it's fundamentally been an importation of the institutions and systems that we've seen in the West. And even as it stands in 2025, October, liberal democracy, even in the West, is failing. So yes, while people are yearning for electoral participation through voting and through elections, what we often see is that substantive democracy, which is to say substantive participation in governance, is actually not going beyond the one-day tick vote, as it were, as people go to the ballot. So I would suggest that if we were to see a far better mode of governance on the continent, we would need to think around what does it mean for us to deepen substantive democracy and democratic participation for the citizenry. Now, in the South African context, that has been attempted through public participation. And I think at the moment, what we're seeing in current affairs with the Matlanga Commission and the parliamentary ad hoc committee probings that are going on, it's attempting to deepen that notion of participatory democracy. However, the institutions of liberal democracy themselves are what are failing the citizenry, not only on the continent, but globally. So I do think that at the heart of it, there is a fundamental problem that needs to shift with liberal democracy as it stands.
You know, interestingly enough, Professor Kumalo, I'm thinking at the recent national dialogues, I participated as a delegate, and we were sitting particularly on the constitutional panel looking at the concept of Ubuntu, the fact that there is a belief that there's a common understanding of that. And some of those I was with were saying no. So my question to you, Professor Kumalo, is as somebody who is steeped in the canons of the works of Mqai, of Goba, I want to hear from you, what would, in practice, African democracy look like as a lived experience for majority of South Africans?
To be honest with you, Tsepiso, I'm currently working on a book that's attempting to answer that very question, and I haven't yet gotten to the conclusion of that, which is to say, what would the institutions necessarily look like? However, I do think that as it stands, and what we're seeing globally even, it's not even a matter of my own argument, what we're seeing globally is that the checks and balances that are supposed to be put in place are not necessarily functioning. Now, South Africa is a bit of a curiosity in the sense that, insofar as we are arguing for the rejection of liberal democracy, we're still abiding by it quite substantively. So, for example, the judiciary is able to check and balance the executive authority and or parliamentary authority for that matter. Whereas in the context of the United States, we just saw, I think it was about 2-3 days ago, the legal arm of the Trump administration, I forget her name now, basically appeared before Congress and she refused to answer any questions. The Trump administration is refusing to adhere to judicial decisions. And so we're seeing the beacon of democracy actually failing. Now, a lot of folks will say to you, okay, fine, what we've seen on the continent are communitarian practices. And this is the school of thought that we see, for example, in personhood, specifically communitarian personhood in philosophical circles on the African continent. So people will say deliberations are the best way to go. So, for example, we should organize ourselves around collective decision making. I'm not convinced that that is necessarily the way to go, precisely because even the school of communitarian personhood, as we find it in African philosophy, is always a response to the liberal individualism that we've inherited from the West. So to answer the question quite simply, I would ask that you give me just a bit more time to do my research to come to the imaginings of those institutions and how they would function.
And of course, we'll come back to you on that. Dr. Mongae, coming back to you and picking up from that conversation about what would be incongruent to African political life. We've seen the North particularly monopolize this idea, the notion of what good governance is, what democracy is, from the assertive state model of Russia, China, to the hollow democracy that we see now in the United States that Professor Kumalo spoke about. I mean, the executive orders that President Trump is reeling out by the second. Yeah. People are questioning that, and it's before the courts. So why should they still maintain that legitimacy of dictating to Africa of what is good governance, what is a working democracy?
Good question. Simple yet a complex one. And I'll take a step back by asking two things. One, not asking, but rather addressing two things. One, it's important that we differentiate between governance and democracy. And what we're hearing amongst Africans, even with the stats that you spoke about, in considering the difference between, the demand for democracy versus its supply, Africans are asking to be governed. And it's getting to a point whereby some would arguably say that how we are governed at this point in time, we are not as strict, if you look at what's happening in West Africa and so forth. But to your question on who is to dictate what the standard of democracy is when democracies or governance within these countries, be it Russia, be it China, be it USA, it's falling apart within these countries. I would also arguably say that who determined what the standard is? And I would also say that post-1960s, when African countries were gaining their independence, African countries, I mean, if you look at the Organization of African Unity before it transitioned to the AU, its primary focus was on political sovereignty. And once that was attained, it was then a question of, okay, we now have political sovereignty. How do we then provide economic sovereignty? How do we then determine which political and economic systems work for us? And African countries did not give themselves the time to actually determine what does the developmental model look like in an African context. And hence then the adoption, so to speak, of liberal democracy. And I intentionally use the word liberal because there is a false assumption that there was no democracy prior to colonization. And it is somewhat limited or narrow perspective, as if you look at Lekgotla meetings in Botswana, South Africa, various parts of African countries, when you look at that particular, in those particular contexts, it was kingdoms that were ruling and so forth, but there were still democratic processes. And I suppose it also brings forth the question of what is actually democracy to ordinary Africans? What is governance to ordinary Africans? And is it possible to be governed well outside of a democratic system and to reject a Western democratic system, some would take it as rejecting democracy, but it goes back to the question that you asked earlier on. Then what does it look like to reimagine what democracy in Africa actually look like? And is it to actually abandon what democracy is? Because one would arguably say that democracy is democracy for and by the people, regardless if it's in the USA, UK, Germany, South Africa. Democracy is democracy. The processes, tools, systems that you adopt to facilitate this democratic process is what then comes into question. But to try and answer your question, I would say that democracy is for and by the people. As soon as people feel left behind from the system, is it really a democracy, or is it a democratic system without the people?
Now, interesting question. I'm looking at contemporary examples. We're seeing a list, I mean, a host of elections on the continent and beyond. And the youth are the majority globally. And what we're seeing is the candidates that are being fielded, particularly in African countries, are octogenarians, etc. And I was having a conversation with one of my friends and colleagues from Not Too Young to Lead about, should there then be a conversation about constitutional age limits? And I'm talking on the upper scale, if there are constitutional age limits about who can participate in elections. And he was saying he doesn't think that that's, you know, that should even be a conversation. But when we talk, particularly from a Pan-African doctrine, I'm just wondering, if the Kofi Annan Foundation is saying there is an erosion of democratic norms which is spilling into Africa, has it always been the case in Africa when we talk about how unfairly skewed it is against the youth, who are actually the majority? And has there ever really been a Pan-African doctrine that is applied as a litmus test of the workings of elections?
Sure. So your point on even the age limit, I agree with your friend in the sense that, yes, on paper, I mean, African leaders are about 4 times above the median age in Africa. The median age in Africa is 19 years old. So to have a 90-year-old, 80-year-old president leading the youngest continent, there can be discrepancies. But I would also argue to say that to put an age limit, one would say, isn't it ageist?
That's what he said.
Yeah, and another limitation is to say that if institutions aren't functioning and you've got a young president, it doesn't matter how old the president actually is. And you know, I actually love this question because it actually forcing us to kind of probe into what the actual limitation is. And you asked a very beautiful question to say that, has there ever been a time whereby we had almost like an inclusionary democracy? And I think that that is actually beginning to touch root on where the discrepancy is. I arguably say, I mean, my whole thesis is based on this conversation around how do Africans actually, why do they support democracy? What are they actually responding to? If it's not producing what it's meant to, what exactly are we supporting in this political system? And to go back to your question, I would arguably say that if you look at even the liberation movement in South Africa, across the continent, it's always been grass movement led. It's always been a decentralized movement and system, so to speak. And the movement was called the liberation struggle, not the democratic struggle, not the fight for democracy, but the fight for freedom. Transitioning from a very decentralized system whereby even the authorities and ordinary citizens, there were no gap between them, into a more, it's almost overnight, having a more centralized system, there was then this growing gap between the state and citizens. I'll bring it back home and say that in South Africa, for example, like I mentioned, the fight was never for democracy. The fight was for liberation. The fight was for freedom. The fact that if we had to take it back to languaging, there is, what is a vernacular word for democracy? You know, there's this piece on, if you look at in isiXhosa, for example, it is inkululeko, which directly translates to freedom. if you ask the older generation, there's a whole survey done in which people in the Duncan village, also in the Northern Cape, were asked, what is democracy to you? And the word that they kept going back to is inkululeko, which means freedom. And there is a vast difference between freedom and democracy. And what we're seeing across the continent, and also in the South African case to be specific, is a growing gap between how people, I won't say experience democracy, but how they're choosing to participate in this democratic system.
Professor Kumalo, let me come back to you and also continue around what you expressed and what Dr. Mongae spoke about earlier on. And when we go back to the whole issue of indigenous knowledge systems. So if then we were to look back at how it was applied, affected pre-colonial times, but particularly around African societies and around later day leaders like your Kwame Nkrumahs, your Thomas Sankaras, their ideals of what democratization looks like, constitutionalism. What were the forebearers' implementations of, say, consensus councils, whatever they were? In what form did they take? And are there examples of something that we can see as green shoots in modern day society of that?
Thanks for that question, Tsepiso. So the two things that I want to touch on and maybe sort of thread, some thinking here with Dr. Mongae's contribution to the conversation. So what I pick up quite a bit in her contribution is this idea that, I think the first useful claim that she makes is to say that before the uptake of liberal democracy, we ought not to think that there weren't democratic institutions on the continent. Right, that's the first thing. Then the second thing is the proposition of freedom, right? So the distinction between freedom and democracy, which is very, very useful, I think. Now, I wanted to actually pose a question to her, which is to say, in the context of her thinking as she's sort of talking to us this afternoon, I'm thinking about one thing, which is to say, can we really actually call this thing democracy, the thing that existed prior to the implementation and the uptake of liberal democratic institutionalism? I asked that question precisely, Tsepiso, because of the question that you're posing to me, which is to say, in our imagining of what was in existence in the pre-colonial era, we often find the language with which to term it as democracy. Now, go back to Hannah Arendt. She did a very interesting and useful public lecture at Bard College in 1966 titled Revolution and Freedom. And she makes a very interesting point where she goes, and this is the entire sort of political theory tradition, going back to the times of Plato, going back to Socratic thinking. She makes a distinction to say that the individuals who participated in public freedom, who participated in deliberations, even in Greek antiquity, were not as a mass amount of individuals. So what we're really actually seeing with the breakdown of liberal institutionalism, liberal democracy in the North, in the West, is a regression, I would suggest, to democracy's actual and fundamental core, which is actually an oligarchy, right? And I make that particular claim on the basis of the notion of the distinctions that Hannah Arendt makes when she talks about liberation and freedom. And she says that the people who participated in the agora, the people who were deemed to be part and parcel of the public citizenry, were individuals who held slaves, who were necessarily unburdened from the necessity of life, right? i.e. feeding yourself, clothing yourself, sheltering yourself. Those basic necessities were handled by the slave in the realm of domesticity, which allowed a very minuscule number of individuals to participate in public deliberation, in the context of making decisions for the polity, in the context of making decisions for the city-state. Now, again, when I make that particular example of slavery, I don't want us to think of racial capitalism insofar as it manifested itself in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries in North America through the transatlantic slave trade. No, I'm thinking here of necessarily slaves who held some modalities of liberties, but were not necessarily public participants, and who took care of domesticity's necessity, right? Now, she then makes a claim that the folks who actually get to participate, and the reason why those freedoms and that public participation becomes expanded to individuals, it's not because we have had any innovation in revolutionary thought. No, it's the rise of technology. So technology allows us to unburden ourselves from life's necessity, which allows more individuals to enter the public realm, to participate in democratic deliberation, in decision making. It's not because we've actually said, oh my gosh, liberal democracy is so brilliant and it's this thing that brings us freedom. No, and she makes that precise distinction between liberation from life's necessity and freedom, which is what Dr. Mongae is talking about, which when she says a lot of individuals associate democracy with freedom. What is freedom? Freedom from life's necessity. So if you go to the public realm today, and not even in the public realm, we walk the streets and you say to an individual, what does freedom mean to you? The individual will say to you, freedom means a job which will allow me to put food on my table, which will allow me to put shelter over my head, which will allow me to clothe myself and to provide for my children. That is freedom. And the individual who makes that particular claim makes that claim as far back, and it has resonance with the claims that were made by individuals who are petitioning for freedom as far back as Greek antiquity, right? So that's what Hannah Arendt means when she says freedom from life's necessity, the ability to be able to participate in public life without those things bearing down and on you and inhibiting your ability to participate in public life. Now, to then say, what did life look like prior to the adoption of liberal democracy, I think is a very important question, because we have invented ideas all the way from Nkrumah's time. We've invented, because there was this yearning of sort of quote unquote shrugging off the yoke of colonial incursion. But that didn't necessarily mean that invention was anything that took us back to a pre-colonial era. And to also talk in those terms of going back to a pre-colonial era, I think is fundamentally problematic because of the challenges and the trip-ups that it'll give us, because we'll never know what it was like prior to colonial incursion necessarily. We do know that there were councils, deliberative councils. We do know that decisions were made in conversation with individuals. But again, who were the people that sat on those councils, I think is an important question. And what I think for me is really crucial is to say, as we go forward, what kind of institutional representation do we actually want? It shouldn't be a romanticization of the past, and it ought not to cling to liberal democracy because we're seeing liberalism failing us. How then do we imagine new institutions?
Well, Professor Kumalo has certainly said a lot, and some of it actually links to what I wanted to ask you, Dr. Mongae, and you can respond to him and also in tandem respond to my question, because if we're saying it's a fallacy that we can imagine what those pre-colonial deliberative systems look like and their application, then the question must be asked about the intelligentsia and their interpretation of literature, because it would have been informed by something. And the more we talk about reformation, it means that it's an improvement of something that is tangible. And tying that with also the reality of the elite and how then that has trickled down to the ballot box exercise, which suggests that there is inclusion, that participatory democracy is real and it's fair.
Yeah, I actually disagree respectfully with Prof. Kumalo, only from the perspective that I agree with the part that we should not romanticize the past, but I disagree that we should not kind of look into that and take lessons onto that. And I say that from the premise of two things. So earlier on, I defined democracy, and literally it coming from the Greek terminology of demokratos, which means for and by the people. Second to that, democracy is an ongoing experiment. And what I take from what Prof. Kumalo was saying is that over the centuries, how democracy is exercised, how it is understood, how it is institutionalized, has evolved over the centuries. And obviously with each century, you know, first industrial revolution, second, third, and so forth, things such as technology, you know, evolving how we understand democracy, how we participate in this democratic process. But to address both questions at the same time, I would say that right now, what democracy or the democratic experiment in Africa is lacking, and one of the critiques that always comes out is that it does not take the unique characteristics that shape the African continent, that it is a copy and paste model. We all agree to say that, you know, we reject the assumption that democracy was introduced post the colonial period, but it was institutionalized. Perhaps you can say that there were democratic practices, but it was institutionalized post-independence. To that, what does it then look like to take the unique characteristics of Africa into consideration? What does it look like to institutionalize certain elements, African philosophies, and what that speaks into is into the cultural aspects, which we acknowledge, and Dr. Kumalo made note of this, that you know, this word of communal, participatory democracy, what does that look like to be institutionalized? I would take it back. You mentioned some African philosophies, and Ubuntu being one of them. In South Africa's case, actually Africa at large, but actually let me just draw it here in particular. The word Ubuntu, we always mention it a lot. It's only mentioned in the Constitution once, meaning that it doesn't inform policies, economically, socially, but it's a tagline that is used. When you look at, especially like, you know, whether it's rural areas, you know, in townships and so forth, that communal way of life is still entrenched in how people live. Even prior to apartheid, prior to colonialism, even during those periods, Ubuntu was the way of life. Prof. Ramose is like, I would say almost like the father of the Ubuntu philosophy. And he speaks on how there was a certain economic, political, and social ethics that societies at large were embedded into. Even if you look at the very definition of Ubuntu, motho ke motho ka batho, meaning that my existence does not, I am not a being without you. In even the way in which we greet. For example, ka Setswana we'll say dumelang okay, which literally means whatever, greetings, hi, salutation, hi. Okay means, literal meaning is where are you?
Yes.
Where are you in this communal setting? Getting, you're acknowledging I'm here, I'm alive, I'm here. When you don't greet someone, you know, someone will say, you are acting as though you do not see me. You do not see my existence. And I just point that and make reference to that to say that those cultural aspects of Ubuntu, whether or not we are conscious or unaware of it, is still largely shapes how we communicate with each other. So how do you then do with a system whereby it is very like liberal democracy? Some of the core tenets and assumptions is, you know, individual freedoms, individualism, even with advancing of freedoms, whose freedoms are we advancing? And at whose expense? Okay. So what does it look like?
Because we are running out of time, there's so much to talk about. I'd come back to you, Professor Kumalo. You spoke about the digital medium, and when we talk about participation, so they say digitization is creating a sense of inclusion while it also is inculcating exclusion. But I want us to also understand when we talk about democratic norms and participation, the framing of some of these categorizations, particularly when we talk about women participation in terms of numbers. But I want to understand, are we gendered, are we feminist in our lens, policy lens? And when we talk about sovereignty, when we talk about economic structures that are preventing people from being a central part of defining, redefining, and also affirming our democratic architecture. Have there been notable changes or regression in your view, Professor Kumalo?
Thanks for that question, Tsepiso. And I love that you asked the question of demographic representation, right? So a great deal of individuals, and I think it was Tessa Dooms, she's the one who makes this point quite clearly. She says what South Africans are really, really yearning for, which is one of the reasons why we've seen, quote unquote, break into ethno-nationalist politics in our country, is that folks are yearning to be represented. Right? Whether I am queer, whether I am female, whether I am disabled, whether I am black, whether I am purple, green, or blue, I want to see somebody who looks like me representing my interests. And insofar as we have seen a proliferation of digital media, for example, in democratic spaces, I don't necessarily think we've leveraged that quite sufficiently in terms of being able to reach individuals where they are and where their concerns lie. Because for every individual who wants to see themselves represented, their interests, their needs, their necessities will by necessity differ, right, according to where they're located within the socio-political domain. And this is one of the reasons why I think I agree with Dr. Mongae here. And I might have been misrepresented or maybe misheard, maybe that's the best concept to use here, which is to say, insofar as I'm saying let's not romanticize the past, I'm also not trying to say let's not look into the past. So if you think about this question of representation, episode that you've just pointed out, it's curious enough for us to consider who were the people who sat on those councils historically, right? And according to what merit did they actually get onto those councils? We must also not forget that concepts such as Ubuntu have been Christianized, the whole forgiveness thing, etc., which is very cute, if I'm being honest with you. Kepha ngesiZulu saye sithi thina izinyane lemvubu kadliwa ngayingwenya kwacweba iziziba, which has a retributive element of justice to it, which was very beautifully written out of history, right, and forgotten about, the retributive justice component of this very ethic that we look to as our answer to all of our problems. And the question then becomes a question for me around, are we ready yet to actually confront what it means to embed those particular concepts into our institutions, be it retribution, be it retributive justice, and what does that mean again for this question of representation? And I think a curious and beautiful thing, because I'm aware of our time here, a beautiful thing that I would then ask as a political theorist and as a philosopher is the question of what role does technology play in solving what seems to be very, very complex situations? Our desire for transformed and new institutions that are rooted in our Africanness, that also represent each and every single individual. So what role can we use technology to facilitate that? Does it mean, for example, campaigning on representative sort of frameworks? And does that not necessarily boil down to identitarian politics? I don't know. But it's important for us, as we think back to the past, to also consider what it meant for the people who sat on those deliberative councils, who took decisions that had to be abided by because they were taken in deliberative processes.
So, Dr. Mongae, let's talk about what we've seen as evolving spaces of participatory democracy, whether recognized or not institutionally. And I want to also look at multipolarity. With digitization, there has been disinformation campaigns, but there's also been foreign funding of those. And I want to understand how much of that adds to the quality of the democracy that we're seeing, because we've seen that people have created their own spaces of protests to speak out against the democratic principles that they are seeing, or the inaction of the democratic systems. How much is there a definitive and qualitative change when we talk about the politics of parliament, the politics of the streets? Is there actual constitutional recognition of those created spaces, and are they given the legitimacy that they deserve in determining the type of democratic systems that we want?
Long and short of it, I would say no, in the sense that I don't think that, like we acknowledged a bit earlier on, that democracy is an ongoing experiment. The introduction of new platforms such as social media, like you also mentioned, new platforms that people are choosing to participate within this political process. I think that from an institutional perspective, politicians, society at large, I don't think fully know how to respond to that. How do we keep checks and balances in people expressing themselves without infringing on human rights, for example? How do you leverage off of platforms such as social media, where now there's a younger generation that grew up or born into the social media space? How do you incorporate that, but also having checks and balances? So long and short of it, I would say no, they're not fully being recognized, but what we are seeing is how maybe the misuse of it, great for awareness, great for hearing different perspectives and so forth, but what we now leaning towards, because lack of checks and balances and so forth, the abuse of these platforms, sensationalization, these platforms being used to sensationalize matters. Like Prof Kumalo also mentioned, I don't think that it is an irony, so to speak, that there is a rise in identity politics, especially in a context such as South Africa, whereby it is a concept that we did not necessarily speak about 20 years ago, 15, even 10 years ago, but now we're seeing it, you know, manifest itself at a quite a magnificent level. And once again, I think it's being taken advantage of and not necessarily used in a constructive manner to strengthen this process.
So I'm going to ask you both, it's a difficult question to answer in such a short space of time, but if you can, and I'm going to start with you, Prof, that of economic and informational sovereignty going forward, for what would create an Africanist model that would be acceptable beyond this liberal model that we're saying is accepted, but in reality is not working for an African population? What would it take?
I think Muammar Gaddafi died for it, and that was the African dinar, which was a gold standard, unified trade across the continent, where Africa is actually saying, these are our resources and we want gold for them. If you want them, give us gold. I think that would give us economic sovereignty. Information sovereignty, that's a very slippery one, Tsepiso. So I'm not even going to try and take that one. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Mongae. Maybe she might give us something there. But I think there's something to be said about a unified currency on the continent that allows free trade across the continent.
Yeah. Information sovereignty, I've got just a bit of unpopular opinions on that.
We like unpopular.
I would arguably say, just and keeping aware of time, that yes, we should. I don't think it's a main priority, and I only say that because that even when we speak about industrial revolution, 4IR, AI, where does Africa fall into that? Can we really speak so deeply into that, whereby when you check our participation in that, there's some parts of Africa that have not experienced a third industrial revolution. So yeah, that's just like a whole nother conversation in and of itself. But politics and economics can never be separated. And without economic sovereignty, there's a limitation to political sovereignty. 2024 was dubbed, the year of elections in the African continent, but there was also a lot of conversations around funding. There's a lot of conversations around foreign influence. So I would arguably say, and Prof. Claude Ake writes extensively on this, to say that without the economic independence, the political independence is also under question. And I would also agree that the sovereignty, economic sovereignty, would also have to go into industrializing, own your resources. How do we move from producing primary goods into manufactured goods? and this is a very contentious issue, but when you see what's happening in West Africa, there's a lot of popularity, especially amongst the young people. Why is that the case?
Well, thank you very much to you both. A very rich conversation. I think that needed another 4 hours, but thank you very much to Professor Siseko Kumalo, political philosopher and author of Decolonising as democratization, global insights into the South African experience, and Dr. Mmabatho Mongae, who is a political analyst and scholar of Pan-African geopolitics, and speaking to us about Africa's democracy. Is it really working beyond the ballot boxes, the inked fingers and the victory speeches? What is the real nature of it? Does it need to change, and how do we change it? Well, that's it from African Conversations here on Channel Africa. Thanks for joining us. Huh?
It's a very topical